So good morning. Welcome to the Sonoma County Master Gardeners Library Talks. I'm Ann Haddix, a Master Gardener from the class of 2020, and I will be your moderator today. First, I'd like to let everybody know that this talk is being recorded. You'll probably see a pop-up box from Zoom that allows you to opt out if you do not wish to be recorded, although we're not recording anything from the participants. This talk will soon be available on the Sonoma County Gardeners YouTube channel, along with many other presentations, so I invite you to check it out. And there's a lot of technical information in the talk today, but you'll be able to go back and look at the YouTube channel and get the specifics of some of the things that we cover today. I'd like to encourage you to also explore our website, the Sonoma County Master Gardeners website, and our Facebook page, and learn more about the University of California Master Gardeners program, the resources we have available to help you with your gardens, and information on how you can become a Master Gardener here in Sonoma County. And I'd encourage you, if you're interested in gardening and interested in volunteering, to take a look at it. It's really a great program. So now let's get on with today's program. Our talk today is First Irrigation Steps for a Water-Wise Garden, given by Leslie Hart, a University of California Master Gardener here in Sonoma County. Leslie is the Garden Sense Program Coordinator. This talk is another in the ongoing collaboration between Sonoma County Master Gardeners Program and the Sonoma County Regional Library. As many of you know, for several years, each branch in the library system has hosted garden talks throughout the year on a variety of topics for the home gardener. The talks promote the Master Gardener's ethos of sustainability and science-based information. We're pleased to be able to continue this collaboration with the library as we transition to a digital format. And I think the current situation, the pandemic, has really caused us to step outside our comfort zone and make these presentations much more widely available through our YouTube channel. So we're going to look on the bright side for that one. A few ground rules before we get started here today. First of all, please mute your sound and turn off your video for the presentation. You'll still be able to see everything on the screen. It'll just cut off the camera viewing you. This reduces our bandwidth and gives us a more even presentation. Okay, second, questions. If you have questions, we ask that you submit them through the chat box. The Zoom chat box is located in different locations on each device, so you may have to look around for it. It shows as a chat icon at the bottom or top of your screen. On some devices, you can click on the participants icon and find it there. And I think on the iPad, you can click on the three dots for more information and find it there. I'd give you more information, but I really don't know where it is located everywhere. I've found mine now and I'm sticking with that. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation. The moderator, me, and our other Master Gardeners who are on the line as we're speaking will take a look at the questions and provide you with some on-the-spot answers, as well as keep other questions for our presenter at the end of the presentation. We'll also be providing special links and other information related to the presentation in the chat box, just to be sure, so be sure to take a look there as we go through and afterwards. And something I learned today, if you look at the bottom of the chat box for those three little dots, you can click on them and find a Save Chat button so that you can save the links and resources and the questions and answers that are provided during the presentation. This isn't available on all devices, but if you do have those three dots, see if you can do that. Finally, just a reminder, we're recording this presentation. So now let's get on with today's program. I'd like to introduce Leslie Hart, who will be speaking today on First Irrigation Steps for a Water-Wise Garden. Leslie Hart has lived and gardened in Sonoma County for over 25 years after living in Canada, Australia, and other parts of the United States. Moving to the hills above Sonoma as a newlywed, a friend helped her with her first vegetable garden, and she discovered irrigation and deer and gophers. Leslie now lives in Pengrove, where she incorporates native and water-wise plants into her landscape and grows vegetables year-round. She especially enjoys figuring out how to best irrigate the many different sections of her garden efficiently according to their water needs. Retired after many years of teaching high school chemistry, Leslie has been a master gardener and garden sense consultant since 2017, and she is currently the coordinator of the Garden Sense program. Actually, I learned everything I know about drip irrigation from her, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy this talk. So Leslie, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne, and welcome everybody in this quite sort of drippy day, a good day to be inside and talking about water and irrigation. Now, my main goal today is to provide you with some ways to better irrigate your landscape, and doing so without going through all of the steps that I did over my last 27 years in Sonoma County. I'm going to share with you what I have found to be most helpful and what we in Master Gardeners have found to be most relevant. Here are the topics for today. In order to set the stage for the main part of my presentation, which is about drip irrigation and its management, I'm going to begin with water, climate, ways to save water in the landscape, and hydrozones. And then at the end of my presentation, I'll give you a brief introduction and invitation to the Garden Sense program, as well as the same resources that I believe Cleo is going to put up in the chat for you as a PDF file. And so let's talk first of all about where we get our water. Sonoma Water is our local water agency, and it provides drinking water. Potable is the official name for that. Provides that to 9 cities and special districts, and they in turn deliver that drinking water to more than 600,000 residents, both in Sonoma and Marin counties. One important aspect is that no reservoir water is used for agriculture. Our water supply includes surface water, and this is found in our reservoirs. I'll show you those in a sec. Also from groundwater, and agriculture needs to use wells exclusively, but many of us in Sonoma County use wells for the regular water. We also have recycled water, and we do not get our water from snowpack. So here is the Russian River watershed, and it starts north of us in northern Mendocino County and flows for 116 miles down through our watershed and empties into the Pacific Ocean at Jenner. And we're all familiar with the Russian River. I'm sure we've all visited there. There are several dams on the river that provide us with reservoirs. The main 2 reservoirs are Lake Mendocino and Lake Sonoma. And they release water into the Russian River, which is then diverted at Mirabel down near Forestville into some deep wells where the water is filtered naturally as it goes down through the ground and then pumped out from those wells and sent out to the various areas of Sonoma and Marin counties. Let's turn to what our climate is like. We live in a Mediterranean climate, and only 2% of the world's land masses share this climate pattern. Besides the Mediterranean region itself, parts of Chile, South Africa, Australia, and California share this climate. We are all in similar locations, about the same distance between equator and the poles, and all on the western side of continental land masses. And this is why you see plants from these parts of the world in our plant nurseries. You know, we talk about the use of Mediterranean plants. There are some very cool South African and Australian plants that are particularly nice. And having lived in Australia for a number of years, I like being able to bring those Australian plants into my garden. So here are the characteristics of Mediterranean climates in short. We have short, mild, rainy winters and long, warm to hot, dry summers. And this summer certainly was one of those hot ones. Rainfall varies widely from year to year, and the seemingly abnormal droughts, floods, and wildfires are normal for Mediterranean climates, though these conditions are definitely exacerbated by climate change. So let's take a look at some of those effects of climate change. We can expect shorter wet seasons, longer dry seasons, more droughts, and more extreme high water flows. A couple of days ago, I read information from the UCLA meteorologist, Daniel Swain and his colleagues, about predictions for this coming winter. Even though they think it may be a relatively dry winter, they emphasize that the rain that we will get is likely to come in bursts from atmospheric rivers, as has become increasingly common. So how do we garden in our climate? We have unreliable rainfall, and we want to grow food crops, which traditionally are grown in the summer, many of them. We want to have landscapes, so we need to irrigate. Best that we do so thoughtfully, and that we choose plants that suit our Mediterranean climate. Now, recent wildfires, very recent wildfires, especially those close to us, like the Glass Fire, remind us that we also need to keep fire risks in mind as we design our landscapes. There are only 3 ways to save water in the landscape. So let's talk about this triad. If we start from the top, the first of the triad is the site water requirement. And that is referring to plants, what your plant choices are. So make them climate appropriate. Include those Mediterranean plants, include California natives as much as you can, and that will really help with your water efficiency on your property. Now, there are many talks about plants. Sonoma County Master Gardeners love to talk about plants, and there are a few recent presentations. One by Kim Pearson from a couple of weeks ago that is present on our YouTube channel. And then there were a couple by Linda King in September with the City of Santa Rosa. So if you go to City of Santa Rosa Water Smart workshops, you will find the recordings from her 2 presentations. As well as I gave a similar presentation to the one I'm giving now, also in that City of Santa Rosa series. So you'll see that on there too. Now, the second part of the triad is irrigation efficiency. And this is one of our main topics today. Drip is 95% efficient, while spray or rotary sprinklers are only 20% to 70% efficient. And I'm going to focus on drip irrigation today. There will be some stuff about watering by hand, and I think we all like to do some of that watering by hand as well as finding it necessary. So I will, as I said, that's going to be our main topic. The third topic is going to be about how we manage our system, and that will be the last part of the presentation. And I'm going to include some suggestions for those of you who do prefer to water by hand as your major way to water. And also, if you want to make small steps, I'll have some suggestions for how you do that rather than jumping into major irrigation projects. So get an idea of where you all are at this point in your watering. I created a couple of polls, and for those of you who are watching, the polls, I believe, do not show up in the recording. But I'm going to ask you to go ahead and answer this poll question. And it's simply, what is the main way you currently water your landscape? So are you in a place where you're not watering at all? Do you mainly like to hand water with a hose or watering can? Are sprinklers your main source of watering? Are you watering by drip? Again, is your main source. Do you have some of that old soaker hose that was popular 25 years ago? very popular 25 years ago, still in your garden? Or are you choosing some other way to water your garden? So again, I'm asking for the main way. And I'm seeing 24 of 37 of you have voted. I'm going to tell you that for me, my main source of watering is drip. I've turned completely to drip, and having tried out that soaker hose 25 years ago and some of the laser cut drip irrigation, drip tubing, and I'm gradually keep improving the type of drip that I'm using. And although I see one person's still got some of that soaker hose, but most of us are doing drip, and a fairly large proportion are hand watering with a hose or with a watering can. Okay, and a few of you aren't watering at all, and one person's mainly watering with sprinklers right now. So let's go ahead and end the polling, because I think that I had to wait until now. Can you see the results, or do I need to hit share? I think I need to hit share. Okay. So I'm going to assume that everybody can see this, and that one of my cohorts will tell me if it's not showing. So again, drip is the major source of irrigation for all of us here, with a fair number of people who are hand watering. Okay. So let's continue on to talk more about drip. So this may be some review for those of you who are using drip, and perhaps we'll give you some new ideas about how to use your drip system. Those of you who are hand watering, I'm going to encourage you to consider trying drip. The same with those of you who aren't watering at all, to try drip, and hopefully some of the suggestions I give you that will help you get started in that way. Again, rather than feeling like it is a huge project, which can itself be an impediment if you consider it to be too big. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop that and close the poll, and let's go on and talk about the next slide, and talk about hydrozoning before we go on specifically to talk about drip irrigation. The term hydrozone has two parts to it. Hydro refers to water.
Leslie, we could still see the poll.
You may have to try to close it on your own computers. Would you try that? See if that works. I closed it from my end.
Yeah, this is Claire, and I closed it and it worked fine.
Okay, great. Okay, so everybody go ahead. If the poll is still on there, go ahead, and I think you hit the X up in the top corner and it will disappear from your screen. We're going to have a second poll a little bit later in the presentation as well, but then we'll be nicely trained in polls. Okay, so hydrozones. Hydro refers to water, and zone refers to some area, and that an area that has similar characteristics. So hydrozoning means that you are grouping plants with similar water needs together. And in this example, we have containers, raised beds, trees, and so on. The idea is that you have separate irrigation zones for different plant water needs. So containers, for instance, need a little bit of water every day. They tend to dry out quickly, while trees need to be deeply watered and less often. So you want to have those on separate lines. Now, I'm going to experiment here and see if I can use the annotate function. In the meantime, I'm going to let this person in because they're right in front of where I was going. Okay, so can everybody see my red highlighter here? I hope. So here's some examples. Here is one irrigation zone going to pots on, say, on a deck or on a patio. Here is an example of a hydrozone going to vegetables. Vegetables are high water, so they need frequent and more water than generally our landscape plants if we've moved to the low and very low plants. Then here's a line. Let's see if I can see where this starts. This, I believe, is shrubs, and I think the blue line is larger shrubs and trees. I do want to make a note here that this diagram isn't totally consistent with fire-wise considerations these days when we want the area immediately around the house to be inorganic mulch in the 0 to 5 zone. So we do have a few shrubs here that we'd recommend you not put out there. Okay, I'm going to close that annotate function for now. You also need to take into consider microclimates such as shade versus sun. You might have some pots that are sitting in the sun and some in the shade, and be running those for running irrigation for different times on those. And I already mentioned vegetables. And you can have raised beds that are not for vegetables, and they also do need to be watered somewhat more often than do plants that are in the ground. So at my place, I have 12 zones and representations of everything that's listed here on this slide. And part of it's geographic as well. I've got pots in 3 different places, so that's three different valves. It turns out I have them on valves, but you can also use hose bib timers for these, and I'll talk about that in the management section today. It looks like I need to click here. Okay, so let's move to talking about drip irrigation. And as master gardeners, this is what we strongly recommend here in Sonoma County. It is more efficient than hand watering or sprinklers. The water dribbles slowly into the ground, and there's less opportunity for evaporation. That's one of the big pieces. So that's why drip irrigation can be 95% efficient, while sprinklers are more like, can be anywhere from 40 to 70, depending on how well they're tuned, and assuming that you don't even have overspray. So you generally don't have problems with overspray here with drip irrigation. The water goes directly to the root zone, so you're not, particularly how you set it up. I will be talking about in-ground drip, which does moisten the whole area. But again, you're working with an area right next to where your plants are. And it's not being lost to the air with evaporation or wind. Now, there are multiple ways to build drip systems, and I will describe some of them here today. The first is 1/2-inch inline drip, and this contains built-in what we call emitters, and emitters are those holes that you see in the tubing. And if you have some inline drip and you feel it, you know that there's something sitting inside where that hole is. In the old days, I mean, we're talking 25 years ago, I remember getting the laser cut 1/4-inch tubing, and there they simply put holes in it with a laser, and the water dribbled out, but the water came out faster, closer to the water supply, and sometimes didn't get all the way to the end of the line. And that's because that situation was not pressure compensating. So these emitters are designed to be pressure compensating, but I'm going to talk about those on the next slide. Let me go through these in the overview here first. The second type of drip irrigation I'm going to talk about is where you use that black tubing that everybody knows about. The official name for that is distribution tubing, and attach 1/4-inch inline drip to it. And there are a number of situations where this is a good solution, and certainly a good way to start with drip irrigation, particularly if you're on a budget, because it is cheaper than the 1/2-inch inline drip. Then the third source, distribution tubing, that black tubing, plus what we call point source emitters. And the inline drip has become more popular in recent years, but before that, if you have old drip irrigation on your property, then you likely have some type of point source emitters. They are particularly good for sparse plantings, and you can tailor your system to those. And they, as I said, they attach to the 1/2-inch distribution tubing, that ubiquitous black tubing. Okay, let's specifically talk about this inline drip tubing. I mentioned the pressure compensating emitters, and you can see the picture of those at the right, where you can see the hole, and you can kind of see that there is something sitting underneath that hole. And then the diagram below that shows you what goes into that emitter. And what happens is the pressure compensating emitters means that the whole line has to be filled before the water comes out of that hole. And when it does come out, it's coming out at the same rate throughout the line. Now, this is particularly important if you have long lines, or if your tubing is on uneven terrain, especially if you're on a hill. So I'll talk a little bit about how to lay out your tubing on hills in a little bit. And so now another piece is that these emitters have a flexible diaphragm on the inside, and that helps them to be self-flushing, which decreases the dangers of clogging due to particulates in the water. And that's especially important if you are using well water. So we do recommend the 1/2-inch inline drip, especially for those on well water. This type of drip is particularly useful for closely planted beds because you're moistening the whole area underneath. You can use it to retrofit established plantings, and I've been doing some of that this year. It works for ground covers, trees, and slopes. I'll show you diagrams of that. I already mentioned the well water. It also works well in containers and vegetable gardens. And for containers, I use 1/4 inch, which isn't necessarily may have a little bit of pressure compensating, but not as robustly as the 1/2-inch inline drip. In vegetable gardens, you can use 1/4 inch or 1/2-inch inline drip. And I'll show some diagrams, some pictures of those in a sec. So here's an example of a simple setup with 1/2-inch inline drip. This is the official diagram, nicely laid out perfectly, that you'll see in the tech guides, the design guides for these. Note that ideally this is a closed system. Let me go to that annotate function again if I can find it. Here we go. So over here is where the water is coming in. In this case, it's probably coming up from PVC, but it can come straight from black tubing. And then at the other end, you can see that you wind it around and connect it to itself. They haven't showed any fittings. We'll talk about those in a sec. And here is an example of a valve. It's a good idea to flush your system. That's part of regular maintenance that I'll talk about later. And you put that flush valve basically at the opposite end to where the water came in. And there we go. So that's the basic system. Let's see what it looks like in situ, as it were. And here's an example of using that, a basic layout. In this case, this is at the Santa Rosa Demo Garden last year. And a number of us put in the irrigation for that project. And you can see that this can be described as a serpentine type of layout. And we're only seeing about half of the 1/2-inch inline drip tubing. So it can go for a long stretch. I think it's at least 250 feet. And notice that the lines are consistently, as much as we could, they were about the same distance apart from each other. This was on clay up in Santa Rosa. So we had wider spaced emitters, 18 inches apart rather than 12 inches. 12 inches is what I use down here in Sandy Loam in Pengrove. But in Santa Rosa, the 18 inches apart is fine. And we tried as best we could to make sure that the lines were also 18 inches apart. This means that you have uniform wetting underneath the surface. Even if it doesn't look like it from the top, the water goes down and it spreads out. A few months later, I went back and took a similar picture of the same area, and you don't see any of that tubing. It's now been covered by mulch, and the plants have done some growing. I think this plant here is probably this one. And you can see this can be invisible. If you've got gophers, you may not want to have too much mulch over it. We keep all of our tubing on top here on my property in Pengrove. Okay, let's turn to another way to lay it out, and this is doing a grid. So this layout, like the one before, provides uniform wetting under the soil surface. So you can see here, we've got the individual, looks like circles, and you go, okay, well, it's not wetting all the way, but it goes down and then spreads out, particularly if you have clay. The soil type determines the spacing and the emitter size. So if you're on clay, you could go as high as 24 inches apart for your emitters, which just seems huge. You also need to have lower gallons per hour. That's what the GPH stands for. Sprinklers are in gallons per minute because they really shoot the water out fast. But for drip, we talk in terms of gallons per hour. So I said these are examples of Santa Rosa in sandier soil. West County or down here in South County, parts of South County, then it'd be more than likely be 12-inch spacing. And a reminder that the tubing is spaced the same distance as the emitters. So here's an example of me putting in a little grid in my own garden. And the thing with the serpentine laying out, if you've got a big space, and particularly if you don't have anything planted yet, to be able to set it out in a serpentine manner is probably really the best. And you don't need to use as many fittings. On the other hand, if you are putting in to existing areas, it can be really hard to put the materials in serpentine. And my neighbor who is here, Valerie, the two of us did this on her yard. We did some retrofitting and decided that the grid really was the best way to go because you've got to have big, long swoops of the tubing otherwise. And so you can see here are the fittings on the side. Again, let me go and get that annotate tool. So here are examples of the fittings. And in this case, I'm just showing it to you with none of the mulch on it. You can sort of see the hint of where the water has gone in here on this one. This is on a little bit of a berm. Now, a part I want to point out to you is over here at the left-hand side, and this is an end cap that can be unscrewed so that you can flush it. There are a number of ways to do this. Many people are familiar with the sort of figure 8, where you fold up the tubing and put the figure 8 on it, and then you can slip it off, open it up, and flush it that way. I early on really liked these end caps. They were easy to use. I didn't have to try to wrangle with that figure 8, but they're a little bit, tiny bit more expensive. Okay, so that's the grid type of layout.
Leslie,
So, yep.
you're at the halfway point and you've just started on slide 19.
Okay, so I better speed up just a little bit. So let's talk about irrigating on slopes with this inline tubing. You want to lay your lines parallel to the slope contour and place emitters above the plants. As you can see, water travels downhill. Just gravity has its effect on water just as it does on the rest of us. Let's talk a little bit about irrigating raised beds. And there are a couple of options for these. One is to use a 1/4 inch inline emitter tubing. And I recommend, if you want to take a screenshot of this so you have the details or look at it later at the recording, that you need your emitter tubing, you need a header of some kind to which you attach that tubing, and it's a really good idea to have shut-off valves. So if you're using this for a vegetable garden and want to fallow parts of it, then you're able to do that by using those what we call microvalves on each line. Often we use 1/4 inch in vegetable gardens, but really to be more robust, and particularly if you're on well water, you can build these systems using 1/2 inch inline drip, and then there's another size that's in between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch. And all of those are found at irrigation stores. This is an example from the Windsor Community Garden, and you can see here's a shutoff. In this case, the water is coming here via PVC because it's coming under pathways. And they put the shutoff, and in this case, it's for the whole bed. It's the design that they need there for their garden. Okay. Here's another way you can use 1/4 inch inline drip, and this is for containers. And I've used bubblers in the past coming up from the distribution tubing, and now I've moved to this 1/4 inch inline drip. So I've listed the various components here. And let me go ahead and use my annotate again to show you. Down here, this is on our deck, and my husband went ahead and put all this 1/2 inch, the distribution tubing. And notice here is an end cap, so we can flush this tubing in the spring. And from that, I have 1/4 inch distribution tubing, or better known as spaghetti line or spaghetti tubing. And then this is attached to some of the 1/4 inch inline drip with 6 inch spacing. And right in here, and you might be able to see it better in this picture over here, is one of those coupler valves. I believe they're called variable flow coupler valve at the irrigation store. But if you talk about, so you might have to describe it when you go, but you can turn them off completely and use them as a shutoff valve. Okay. So let's turn our attention to point source drip, which is good for sparsely planted areas. It is also attached to the 1/2 inch distribution tubing, that black tubing you can get everywhere. And the emitters are pressure compensating. And for clay and clay loam soils, we do recommend 1/2 gallon per hour emitters. You can use closer to the 1 gallon per hour if you've got soil that's on the sandier side. Okay, let's talk about how we place those emitters, especially if we're using the point source. And you can also use the 1/2 inch inline drip around trees and so on. I'll show that in a sec. If you're using point source, you need to match the number of emitters to the size of plant you're putting in the ground, and then you need to keep adding emitters as the plant grows. So this can be somewhat irritating, and if somebody else is maintaining your system, then you're paying them to come back and to keep adding the emitters. But it is critical that you do so. You can't just put that one little emitter in on something that's going to turn into a tree. I was at a friend's house a couple of years ago, and there was one of the emitters literally coming out of the roots. It had got stuck in the roots right at the base of her tree, and the tree had grown so much that the emitter was basically right up against it at that point and was totally useless. So you do need to keep moving the emitters away, particularly from those larger plants. Here I say if you've got a 1 gallon or smaller, that 1 emitter is sufficient, but it really is a good idea to have at least 2 emitters, 1 on each side. And then as you get larger and larger, you need to have more emitters to start with, and then add them as the plant gets larger. So as I said, it's very easy to forget about it. And then, oops, a few years later, you need to revamp your system. So here's how you can irrigate trees. They do need to be irrigated deeply, especially when they are young, to establish their deep roots. I like to use inline drip tubing in a circle. And this is in our aviary. These are pigeons sitting in there, pretty pigeons. And I used soaker hose at some point for this because I had some left over, and then realized how much water was actually spraying out from the soaker hose, and have turned it over into this 1/2 inch inline tubing. Now this is an olive tree, so it doesn't need as as much water as some other trees. You might want to have circles of the 1/2-inch tubing, a couple of circles, perhaps in closer to the tree as well as out here. And then you can go ahead and gradually open this up so that the emitters are closer to where the roots are. And you can see where that is in this picture here. So use the appropriate gallons per hour and spacing for your soil. So I've got mine on the 12-inch drip, and I'm using half gallon per hour emitters. So let's talk about the various components that go into drip irrigation. And although I say here, this is for point source emitters or for 1/4-inch inline, you do need the 1/2-inch distribution tubing, and that is the backbone of your system. One thing that we often forget is how to hold that tubing down on the ground, and for that, these staples are a great idea. And if you have a rubber mallet, to make sure that they are pushed well into the ground, especially if you're doing this in a dry season, then you don't trip on them. Now, the staples are also needed if you're using inline drip. And the fittings are similar for the 1/2-inch part of either inline drip or setting up a system with the other types of emitters I talked about. You've probably seen these compression fittings, and they've been around for years and years, and some people still prefer them. We in Master Gardeners really like this type of a fitting. One name is Power Locks, but there are a number of different manufacturers that all have their variation on the name. I think lock is usually there in the name. For the 1/4-inch, so this is for your 1/2-inch tubing, or if you choose to go all the way to 3/4-inch, these are also available in that size. Here are the analogous fittings. Here's a straight coupler and a T for 1/4-inch tubing, whether it's your distribution spaghetti line or your inline drip. Here is a picture, easier picture to see of that micro valve, micro shutoff, the variable coupler valve. Goof plugs are so useful. Here's an example of a goof plug being used to repair an oops, I forgot, I really didn't want it there, or put a hole in it somehow. Of course, if you really put a big hole in, it's a better idea to go ahead and just replace it with a straight coupler. I was doing some of that this summer. We have a lot of gophers in our area. The other thing you can do, particularly with the inline drip, is go ahead and put a goof plug on the very end. And here's what they look like. They come in packages of, I don't know, 25 or 100, and with 2 different sizes depending on the size of the hole that you're concerned with. Okay. So here's some helpful hints that I've discovered over the years. The first is to use appropriate tools to cut tubing. For example, scissors really don't work very well. You can purchase, I think they will call these pipe cutters. They definitely will not cut PVC. You need much more heavy duty for that, but they will cut your drip tubing. On the other hand, as I've met more and more people who are doing this for a living, they'll just use their pruners to cut, and that curved blade on your bypass pruners works really well to cut any of this tubing, the 1/2-inch distribution or the inline, etc. Also, a good idea to have appropriate tools to put holes in when you're putting in the spaghetti line. And here's I actually really like this one, and this is but it's more expensive. This yellow example is really quite cheap. Both of them, you can sort of get a hint over here. Both of them have a tool on the other end that I didn't know until very recently that really is for putting emitters onto the distribution tubing with the point source emitters, but they work really well for putting the little straight connectors in for 1/4-inch. In the past, I've used pliers to put them on, but I'll tell you, these tools, using that part of those tools really was a game changer for me. Much happier about that. You probably noticed that when you're trying to put fittings on, particularly your 1/2 inch, that it can be quite stiff. And so even though it's counterintuitive to be out there on a hot day putting it in irrigation, that's probably the best time to do it, because the sun will soften up those ends, make it much easier to put your fittings on. You can also slip the end of your pruners into the end of that tubing to help soften it as well, to help spread it out and get the fittings on. These nitrile embedded gardening gloves really help to provide traction when you're putting any of this stuff together. Okay, so that's the tubing itself. If I was an irrigation specialist, I would have started from the house with the valves and moving out and end with drip. But in my experience as a homeowner, that I keep revamping what I'm doing out where my plants are. So I chose to talk about the drip tubing first, get a handle on that. And then here I'm going to talk about how you connect what you're doing out with your plants back to where your water source is. Presumably that if your municipal water source that's near your house, or if you're on a well, then wherever your irrigation line is coming out from your well, presumably that will be on PVC. So if you're using drip, then you really need to have both a filter and a pressure regulator, even if you are working with municipal water. I've opened these up, try to do this once a year in the spring, and I find the finest of silty material in my filters, and I'm on municipal water. So there are two components to this. This is the filter, and then you also need to decrease the pressure, and for that there's a pressure regulator. And drip generally is run at about half of what the water pressure is coming in from the street. And this is an example of a combined set, but you can also buy these separately. It depends on what irrigation store you're going to. Just a note, there are differences between what we call pipe thread and hose thread. So when you're at the irrigation store, you might want to ask, because you may need adapters for that. I have a picture of those in a little bit. Okay, so how do I connect my water source to each zone? And I have a couple of examples here, and both of these are present on my property. If you're watering some distance from your water source, or you need to cross a walkway or other impediment, and or you have a problem with gophers, then in-ground PVC is the best way to connect your water source. Note here in this picture on the right-hand side that these are anti-siphon valves. So this is, I've got valves in this part of the garden. Here's the filter, here's a pressure regulator, and then I'm going to PVC. And so you do need special glues to make sure that this sticks together permanently, and you do need to have good cutters that specifically will cut the PVC to get these ready. So this, you can see we got ready. We put the soil back on that later. On the left-hand side, I have a situation where I added a little vegetable bed. So I just did an above ground system, and here again is your filter and pressure regulator. This is a different design, slightly different from those. Then I've used these power lock fittings to go to the distribution tubing and off to behind the greenhouse where I had my tomato bed. If you have sprinklers and you want to convert to drip, there are a few ways to do that. All of them require a filter and pressure regulator. You can use a conversion kit, and in which case you would choose one of your sprinkler heads to convert. That's the example here, and here's an example of the kit. And then you cap off all of the other sprinkler heads. And I'm pretty sure we have some information about that on our Master Gardener site, and the information will be with these kits, which are available from irrigation stores. So not all of them, you might need to call first. Instead of using the conversion kit, which you need to take apart to clean once a year, you can abandon all of your PVC, add your filter and pressure regulator all the way back at the valve, as you saw in the previous picture, and run your drip line from there. Or you can, it's sort of a hybrid of the first two, add your filter and pressure regulator at the valve, convert the drip line at PVC, but because you've got the pressure and the filter and pressure regulator back at the valve, you can just simply add your drip tubing onto it here. You'd still cap off all of the other sprinkler heads. Okay. So now that we've got the system in place, let's talk about how we're going to manage it. The goal is to apply the right amount of water at the right time. And to do that, we first need to talk briefly about plant water needs. Plants draw water and nutrients from the soil up to the leaves. So it comes up from the roots, the water in the soil. And we call that transpiration. And there is also evaporation, both from the surface of the soil, and you can see that in this diagram here, and also from the surface of the plants, things like dew, for instance. They will evaporate during the day. Now, whether we call this ET, the big long name is plant water needs, but we combine evaporation and transpiration and call it ET, evapotranspiration. Weather will have a direct effect on these plant water needs. So temperature, as well as solar radiation. So those are two related but somewhat separate effects. Also the humidity and the amount of wind. So you could have a hot day in September, but it's a shorter day than a hot day in July where there's a lot of solar radiation from the sun that's directly above us. So that's an example of the difference between temperature and solar radiation. So here's what happens in Sonoma County, and this example is from a weather station that is in Santa Rosa. And I can't remember which one it is. It might be the Bennett Valley one, Bennett Valley area. And you can see on this slide, on the y-axis, we have inches per month. And on the x-axis, you have months of the year, and this is for the whole year. And the blue line represents the plant water needs, particularly because we're planting things that are not native here. We're planting food and other landscapes, and we're putting in new plants. So then, even if they're natives, they need to be watered during the summer. And the black dashed line is a rainfall. So you can see that we really need to replace the water that we're not getting from rainfall, but that is being evaporated from the plants in the soil. We need to replace that with irrigation. That's why we do. So here's a typical irrigation pattern. Again, inches are on the y-axis, and in this case, we're going March through November for the season, irrigation season. This jagged line, that's the ET that was nicely smoothed out, the plant water needs. So what usually happens is, even those of us who are master gardeners are guilty of this, I'm sure. I certainly am, or certainly was before I put in a smart controller, that we wait until our plants look a bit peaked, and in April, and then whomp, we turn the irrigation on. At that point, they're small, they're just starting to grow out in the new season, and so we're really wasting this amount of water. We get to July, and they start looking peaked again and wilting, so we go and we whomp it up again. And by the time we think to do that, we're actually already decreasing the amount of water that those plants need. So we leave it up there. It feels hot, and this year it certainly did with 100-degree days in September. And we leave the irrigation up and finally turn it off with the first rains. And we've managed to waste all of this water, because in the fall, the solar radiation is less. The sun is at an angle, and the days are shorter. So even if it feels hot, we're not losing as much from ET during that time period. Okay, so let's talk about what type of management system you want to help you with this. And this is going to relate to whether you're hand watering, whether you've got a situation of a hose bib that's going to drip, or you're using irrigation controller and valves that are going to drip. So let's talk first about watering by hand. If you want to be more careful about watering by hand, if you're a person who goes on a daily basis, you're checking on your plants, there are great reasons to be watering by hand. But if you discover that you're not being as careful, you might want to create a watering schedule on your calendar, especially if you're watering something like succulents that in the ground that may not need water except for about once a week, and everything else is on drip, it's easy to forget about those. So if you have a calendar on the wall or on your phone, it's a great idea to put a reminder in there. And then if you are running stuff from a hose, not actually holding on to it, or if you've got a drip system that doesn't have a timer on it, because you're just, particularly if you're just starting to try some of this stuff out, you can go ahead and set a timer on your phone or a kitchen timer in the house to remind you to turn off the hose. How many of us have forgotten to turn off that hose? I certainly have. Now, if you're ready for a more automated approach, you can go ahead and use digital program timers on hose bibs. And this is an example here from my garden. This is going to that vegetable bed. You saw the bottom part of this. This actually is a fancy dancy gadget timer that my husband gave to me as a present. You're more likely to see timers like this. And notice here, you've got your anti-siphon, you've got your filter, you've got your pressure regulator, and then you're going. So that we call this a hose bib assembly. And so this, particularly if you're just at the beginning of wanting to have some automatic timing, this is a great way to go if you're not ready to go all the way to valves and controller. And it certainly is what I did. I had 12 of these and then finally went to valves and controller. So here's an example of that hose bib assembly. This looks a little bit different from the one before. Here's your timer, your anti-siphon. Here is that same filter pressure regulator. You saw that picture earlier. Since this is what we call pipe thread, then there are a couple of adapters. Folks in the irrigation store can help you with this. Depending on where you go, you may or may not need those adapters because every irrigation store has their own examples, their own equipment that will do the same job. And so then here are some of your hose end going to drip that you have here at the end of your hose bib assembly. Now, if you're putting this on a hose bib, otherwise known as an outdoor faucet, and you still want to have access to your hose, then you might want to put a Y connector in like this. We don't recommend huge manifolds. They can be very heavy. And then you might think about perhaps going to some other system or even building yourself another hose bib to do that. But the Y allows you to still have that flexibility of having the hose to water by hand or for any other reason in your yard. Okay.
Leslie, time
Yep.
check. You're at 55 minutes and slide 38.
Okay. So I think I've sped up a bit and we'll be okay. I'm looking at probably another 15, 20 minutes and then time for questions after that. So if you're tired of replacing batteries or you want to be more efficient, then you might decide it's time to bite the bullet and go to valves and a smart controller. And if you've got a small yard, your hose bib timer might work just fine for you, and that's great. We often recommend those on garden sense visits, particularly for people who are not ready to do really big irrigation projects or are on a small property with watering a small area. But if you do move to valves and smart controller, then here's a little bit of information about those. Irrigation controllers are what we call them. Controller is a short name for those. And one controller runs the entire irrigation system. It opens and closes the valves. So this means it has to be wired. So when we did this at my home, it meant we were running wire underneath the house, which was an adventure. And I wanted the adventure at that point. But this is something you may decide to hire somebody for if you're not comfortable going to this stage of valves and control. I think most people would hire somebody who knows what they're doing. The friend who helped me was a retired irrigation specialist, so I was more confident in what we were doing. So you can have multiple programs to group the valves by hydrozone, and you can have multiple start times for each program. It depends on how fancy the controller is. And I think these are probably in the $100 to $200 range. We do recommend master gardeners, and particularly in Garden Sense, and all of our water agencies that you use a smart controller. And this means that you can, the controller is going to emulate more of this ET part of the graph, this ET line. You can put in what are called seasonal setbacks. This means the percentage of the highest water need month, and I'll show you those in a sec. You can attach a weather sensor to it, and which will then allow it to automatically adjust to immediate weather conditions. And they can also be attached to more of a web system and weather stations within the area. You do need to program them carefully. So here's the example of seasonal setbacks, and this is current. This is based on historical ET data. I put a note in there if you want to take a screenshot. If you wanted to set up your hose bib timer, you can do that on a monthly basis. You can see July is our month of highest water need, and then it goes down both sides of that. So here we are in October, where historically we're down to half of the water needs of July. So if here's a tool that's very useful from the city of Santa Rosa that can help you with that timing. And this is for peak time in the summer. I have excerpted parts of their chart here to show you. This is called Water Smart Yard, and I've put the link up the top. I think it's also on the PDF that was put into the chat. But if you simply Google Water Smart Yard Santa Rosa, this will come up. So near the bottom of the page, as you scroll down, you come to one that shows what's required in peak time. And so in July, and I have just taken out the part that's for low water use plants on drip, because that's of course what we're recommending. So in this case, we're saying, oh, let me tell you what it's based on. Of course, precipitation or rainfall is measured in inches, and then it's basically falling, and then we need to convert this into gallons. So it's based on 1 inch of precipitation in 1 hour, and we can say onto 1 square foot. So it's like, okay, but that's not how I measure the irrigation. So I went ahead and with help of one of the folks at City of Santa Rosa Water, figured out how this translates into what we're going to use for irrigation. So if you're on clay soil in Santa Rosa and you're using half-gallon emitters and you have them 12 inches apart in a grid or that serpentine pattern I showed you, then you can use these numbers exactly how they're given. The 32 minutes in peak time, that's per week. If you then you can, you know, if you are using 1 gallon per hour emitters, it's a combination of how many emitters you can have in 10 square feet. So it's 6 gallon per hour emitters within 10 square feet. So I went ahead and translated that to this grid pattern because that's what makes sense to me. So in this example, you can set your irrigation system to run for 16 minutes each on Monday and Thursday, for instance. And we recommend that you run your irrigation either early in the morning or late in the evening. So I've set it for 6 a.m. And then if you notice runoff, particularly if you've got heavy clay, you could split that 16 minutes into 2 8-minute time periods, and you run those an hour apart. So it's like the water gets partway into the ground, you let it settle in, and then you go ahead and put it in, you run it for another 8 minutes, which will push the first water down and add some more to it. So most times with drip, you really don't need to do that second watering on the same day. You usually don't need to split it, but you certainly can. It's really common with sprinklers that you need to do that on clay soil. Now, the Water Smart Yard recommendations are updated every week. So notice here, I said 32 minutes there in peak time in July. Yesterday, I went on and looked to see what the recommendations are for this week. We do this weekly, so it was updated on the 8th based on historical and previous weeks' rainfall and temperatures, ET requirements. And so here we're down to 65%, which means 18 minutes per week for your low water use plants on drip. And notice in here, they also have a note, because there was possibility of rain. It says state law prohibits irrigating within 48 hours of measurable rainfall. I don't think it was measurable this morning, so you're okay to go ahead and irrigate today, but they add this. And then of course, this isn't available during the winter because when it's raining, because we're not irrigating at that point. Okay. A few last things here. Even though you've gone ahead and set up your system and you've used WaterSmart Yard to set up your timing, and by the way, even if you're not in Santa Rosa, down here in Pengrove, I might run it for a little bit shorter than the 32 minutes. I might take 10% off it and run it for 29 minutes for a week, but it's a really good way to start. Cloverdale, you might run it for a little bit longer, and in Sonoma as well. Okay, so you put the system in, you think you've got it all set up nicely, but how about I just check to see if it's really doing what I want it to? And you can do this a number of ways, depending on what equipment you have or what you want to do, how much time you have. So you let the water infiltrate for a while, like 24 or 48 hours after one of those irrigation cycles. You can simply use your finger to see what it's doing. If you want to get deeper in, you can use a screwdriver. And if you're really keen, you can get in there with a soil probe or a narrow trowel and bring out some of that soil and take a look, and you can actually see where the wet soil is. And I recommend you do that, particularly if you're starting to do this. It really gives you a sense of what's going on on your property. You should always maintain your system, and there's an annual system check that we recommend, and this would be done in the spring when you're cranking everything back up. Recommend that you flush the system, walk your property, check all your tubing for leaks, repair those as needed. If you've lost plants or you're putting in new plants, you want to go ahead and adjust your drip system to accommodate those. If you have your hose bib timers, you actually want to have brought those in for the winter, and you want to replace the batteries and reinstall those. If you've got valves and a controller and sensors, you want to take a look at those, make sure they're all working properly. Sometimes the wiring will come loose, for instance. You think you're watering, and luckily I have a flow meter, so it tells me whether there's a problem, but that's not necessarily, most people don't have those. So you really need to go ahead and do that and see what's happening. And also you want to take a look at your controller programming, update it if necessary. So that's in the spring. We're coming into winter. And there are a few things here when we get into December, we've turned off our system, that particularly if you're in an area that has freezes, you might want to cover your above ground valves in some type of a box or one of those toaster cover type of things. Also a good idea to insulate above ground pipes, and I've given you an example from my yard here in the bottom, some of that stuff that you wrap around the pipes. Remove those hose bib timers, remove the batteries, keep the hose bib timers inside in your garage somewhere. Then enjoy the solstice and hopefully winter rains. So how do I start? And I recommend that you start with small changes. Choose a small project. For instance, just one hydrozone. If this is the first time you want to plant the vegetables, for instance, in the spring, that might be your project. And with your hose bib timer, you figure out all the components you need to do that. Evaluate as you go along, what worked, what didn't work, what is working, what is working beautifully, repeat that. And the beauty of drip irrigation is you can make changes so easily with it. All you need are some of those tools and fittings. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and ask for help when you need it. Before we go, just a brief introduction to the Garden Sense program. This is a partnership between the Master Gardener Program of Sonoma County and our water agency, Sonoma Water. And we've been helping residents in Sonoma County reduce their landscape water use since 2013. Just this last week, we received notice that We won a national award. We're the 2020 winner of the SWAT Outstanding Public Engagement Award from the Irrigation Association, which is a national association. So this was a pretty big deal. And SWAT stands for, I need to look it up, I think, Smart Water Application Technologies. And they're a component of the Irrigation Association that promotes landscape water use efficiency. And Greg Plum, our liaison at Sonoma Water, spearheaded our application and wrote it, sent it in, and we're very excited to have received that this year. What we do is we go in teams to conduct home visits to advise and educate residents on a number of things, including removing or reducing their lawn, converting spray to drip as part of that or not, upgrading their existing irrigation, planting climate appropriate plants, and providing some landscape ideas on hydrozoning. Clearly, this picture was taken before the pandemic. We now have some consultants who are going out and doing in-person visits, in which case they're masked, everybody keeps their distance, they figured out ways to lay things out for people to look at them and take turns and that kind of thing. And so, as I said, the in-person visits have started again, and there are a number of us who are doing virtual visits where we still visit the property, but not with the homeowner isn't necessarily present, and there's a lot of emails and Zoom calls and so on to talk with them. Okay, so this presentation is brought to you by Master Gardeners of Sonoma County. We're a nonprofit volunteer organization. If you'd like to support our work and to find out more about what we're about, here's our website. I've listed down below a number of the topics that relate to what I talked about this morning. These next two slides show the resources that are present on the PDF that was put in chat. So if you're not able to grab that, it is here on the presentation itself, and I've given you enough time here to take a screenshot if you want. I checked all of these links yesterday, so they're all active. Okay. And there are also a couple of books that are available from Sonoma County Library, and Cleo and I both took a look on the library site, and I believe there are copies that are available for you to go ahead and put on hold and pick up from curbside, what do we call it? The curbside collection of your books from the Sonoma County Library. So delighted that we're able to get real books from the library. There are also many of these, may be available also in ebook form. So we encourage you to be using our Sonoma County Library. Great resources there. So that ends my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop share and turn it over to the people who are going to ask me questions.
Thank you, Leslie, for a great talk. And just a reminder to everyone that this presentation was recorded and will be on YouTube so that you can go back and look at all those assemblages of parts if you didn't get them all written down and screenshots taken and all those drip irrigation layouts, which I think will be very useful to folks. So now we're going to take a few questions that have shown up on the chat box, and we'll go from there. So Leslie, the first question is, do tech line systems require an air release and drain? And maybe you could explain a little bit about what a tech line system is.
Okay, so Techline is the company that produces the inline drip system. And let's see, they're asking about, what are the two components they asked about?
Air release and drain.
Air release and drain. So I'm not sure exactly what they're asking about for there. So I may need more clarification from them if they want to put it in the chat. But I know that in the systems that I've been doing, we do put a flush on the end of it. So I'm not sure if that's what they mean by drain. And haven't needed in some type of air release. But I think in more complex systems, those would be needed. But as far as I know, and certainly not in my situation, what you see is what I do. It's the drip attaches directly to the system. So hopefully that answers, but if not, they can ask again and I'll get back to them with an answer, a better answer than that.
Great. Okay, the second question, could you discuss plant placement in relation to emitters in the drip line?
Okay, so plant placement, if you're using the 1/2-inch inline drip, that you can, and you have put the tubing in the appropriate distance. So if you're using 12 inches apart emitters and 12 inches apart lines, then you can plant anywhere in there. I mean, other than on your line, you don't want to put holes in your line, because what you've got is uniform wetting under there. Now, if you're using the point source drip, then you need to approximate where you think the roots are, and using the canopy of the plant is a good way to do that. And then, as I mentioned during my talk, you might want to keep moving it if you're using point source. And well, if you put inline drip around a tree, then you're going to be moving that out as the plant grows as well. But the beauty of inline drip in that grid or serpentine pattern is that you can be very flexible in where you put your plants.
Great. Okay, the third question, on a slope, do the emitters point uphill or downhill?
It doesn't matter. They're going to, and this related question is, when you're putting inline drip in, do you need to roll your tubing so that all of your emitter holes are going straight down into the ground? And you don't, and you probably shouldn't, because then you've got more possibility of particulates getting up and clogging your emitters. So it doesn't matter, they're dribbling out slowly. That would be of least concern to me in how you place emitters. Now, if you're using your point source emitters, again, I don't think it's critical because the water is very sticky, and so it's going to dribble out, attach to the plastic, and still dribble into the ground, even there close to where the emitters are, even right there on the slope. It's more critical that you've got those emitter lines going parallel to the slope instead of whomping straight down it. That's the critical part, and then it'd be above your plants. Okay.
All right. Well, the last question is, where can I get inline tubing?
Where can you get inline tubing? The best place to go is to a local irrigation store, and we've got many of those in Sonoma County. And there's a list of those irrigation stores on our lawn removal brochure. And if one of our Zoom support team could take a look on the garden site, take a moment to go onto our website, find the Garden Sense page, and see if the lawn removal brochure is on there. I think it probably is. That gives, it's not necessarily intuitive that you would look at the lawn removal brochure to find out where to get irrigation equipment, but it's tied in with the lawn removal. But it has all the list of irrigation. And I've been in every irrigation store from, I think it's Healdsburg down to here in the Petaluma area, and then west. I don't think there's one in Sonoma, but you'd have to come over here to Petaluma or up to Santa Rosa. So I'm looking at, Roger has talked about the old Techline systems that they did require an air release at the top of the tubing. So yes, the flushing valve can act as a drain at the lowest part of the system. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And one final point, just a reminder, the air release in the valve needs to be at the highest point in the system. Yes,
yes. And you do want to have your valves, when you're putting valves in, you want them to be 12 to 15 inches above the highest part of where your plants are, of where the ground is. So if you don't want to put your valves at the bottom of a hill and up around your house, and it means they don't necessarily look pretty, but they're more effective if you've got them above ground like that. And the picture showed them at about 15 to 20, 15 to 18 inches above. So it looks like Roger says that actually, now I know I've seen inline tubing at both Home Depot and Friedman's. I'm not sure that it's Techline or not. So be sure to check the manufacturer, because a lot of people are, the irrigation stores started with the inline tubing, and then the bigger box stores are adding those components, but they may not be at the same level, the same quality as what you'll get at the irrigation store. Ag has been using the inline tubing for years and years and years. And I think Australia and Israel were really the first countries where the inline tubing was very, very popular and really developed. And then it came over here. So check the manufacturers there. Yep. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, that was the last of the questions and comments. So I'd like
this
to
is Cleo. Can I interject for a second? If we put a number of links and the link to the PDF of resources in the chat area. If you go in the chat and you see the 3 dots, you can save the chat, or you can click to any of the links and it will take you there.
And yes, if you tried to save the chat earlier during the session, it would only have saved the chat up to that point. So if you'd like to save the chat for the whole chat, now would be the time to do that.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Leslie, for such a great talk. And thanks to all of the folks who have been helping with this and getting links up as we've been talking. It was really, really useful. I think it's a great time to start planning your irrigation system for next summer and getting it in the ground and testing it now. So that was perfect timing for a talk. Again, this talk will be posted on our YouTube channel shortly, so you can go back and look at it. And there are a number of links related to this talk that were posted in the chat box or that you can find through the Sonoma County Master Gardener's website. So I'd also like to draw your attention to some upcoming talks. The next talk will be the October Veggie Happenings. That will be on October 13th at 12:30 p.m. And it will be a panel discussion with Master Gardeners, food gardening specialists on the things that you should be doing in your garden now if you're a vegetable garden. You do need to register for this talk, and you can find the registration on the Master Gardeners website. Go and look on the right-hand side of the site where it announces different events, and click on the event you're interested in, and it will give you a registration link. We also have our inaugural, we'd hoped to do it earlier than this, but there was a fire that distracted our attention here in the county. Our inaugural Ask a Master Gardener program, and that will be on October 15th at 12:30 p.m. This is a new program that takes the place of our information tables at local farmers markets, or I will say that augments them. Because we hope to get those up and running again when safety permits. We're really excited to be offering this new format. We hope you'll be able to join us and bring your questions. And again, you must register for this event at the link that's on our website. So check these out and check out other upcoming events. They're on the right side there, and some of these are now in the chat box. So also, again, thanks so much for the library for their ongoing sponsorship and participation and help with this series. Many of the resources and links to today's topics can be found through the library system. If you have a library card, you can do your research there, request books and other resources for pickup, and download many of them digitally. So if you haven't used the library lately, go and check it out and make sure your library card is current. So that's about it for today's presentation. I'd like to thank Leslie again, and thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you soon at another Master Gardener event. And I'll ask any of my co-hosts with this if they have any closing comments.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming and joining us here as we talked about